Thank you very much for the invitation. It's of course a pleasure to be here and also to have the opportunity to engage in a cross-disciplinary perspective. This is not going to be a one-man show, so feel free to raise your hand to interrupt me if I say something which is too technical or that would deserve to be better explained. The title of the presentation is the following: Algorithmic Management at Work Beyond the Gig Economy, from Practices to Theory and Regulation. I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 main topics. I would start with explaining why, as a lawyer, I'm interested in the repercussions of this very profound process of digitization of workplace relationship. At the same time, I will offer some very preliminary findings of an exploration that I've been conducting in the context of a Marie Curie fellowship that I've just finished. And then I will try to look at the current trends in regulation at the supranational level in particular, learning something from the world of the gig economy. You would be quite familiar with the phenomenon of workers that are organized, mediated, dispatched by platforms such as Uber, Deliveroo, Bolt here in Paris, and so on and so forth. I work on the gig economy in the context of my PhD dissertation, but one of the main findings that we can learn from these subsegment of the labor market is the adoption of new methods for running the business in a quite efficient way. The issue is that this new set of organizational practices have also consequences at the workplace level in terms of productivity, in terms of wellness of workers. So, first of all, I would like to start with a focus on the spirit of this research stream, and in particular also an explanation of why, together with Professor Valerio De Stefano, who is now at York University in Canada, we decided to publish this book titled Your Boss is an Algorithm, where we try to condense years of research in an attempt to make the findings, our interpretation, accessible to a broader, non-technical audience. We embarked in this experience in an attempt to translate the legal research to make it simple, to make it affordable also for non-expert people within and outside the academic community. And then I will focus on the importance of data-driven management at the workplace. First of all, I would like to start with the very spirit of the research, which is an attempt to demystify the widespread assumption that innovation must be tolerated even if it is not complying with regulation. For years, we have been listening to this idea according to which true innovation must ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I'm not that I'm saying this in a business school, which can be somehow not the place where you can share this information, but I always been having this conversation with my colleagues, and we agree on the fact that there could be another way of designing infrastructure and organizational practices that are both innovative and sustainable. First of all, we should also try to understand that techno-determinism is not the way forward. In particular, we after researching for so many years, we realized that many technologies are implemented at the workplace level in a dysfunctional way, meaning that workers who are going to be subject to them are not consulted in the implementation phase, and causes many disruption in the relationship between the contractual parties at the workplace level. So, of course, technology is quite positive. Coming here, I went through a construction site, and of course, people were using a digger. No one was considering to dig it personally. And this is a quite standard explanation of the positive benefits of new technology, of new tools. At the same time, the way in which we adopt the technology, the impact and the effort that we put in organizing, conceiving, negotiating terms and conditions of works are gonna be very impactful, not necessarily on the quantity of jobs that will be available in the future, another big discussion, but on the quality. So the first key takeaway of the book is that we should be able to shift our approach, moving from a quantitative understanding of the labor market, the number of jobs that are going to be destroyed by technology, to a qualitative. What are the key terms and conditions? What are the contents of jobs? This is the only way to make sure that humans are not redundant by default, that they do not become obsolete. This is not working, I'm afraid. So the other key, The other key starting point is a broader reflection on the impact of technology on the labor market. You are following, I think, the discussion that has been prompted by the emergence of generative AI, such as ChatGPT, and I mean, some days ago, after 10 years, again, on the Atlantic, I realized that people were citing this 2013 Oxford published article on the number of jobs that are going to be computerized, because AI was not even a thing in 2013 because of technology. They, according to the authors, almost 47%, so 1 out of 2 current jobs in the next 10 or 20 years were about to be destroyed by technology. Now, the study has been highly criticized. The methodology has been demystified because the authors simply focused on the jobs, on the professions as a monolith, as a unique set of skills and tasks. On the contrary, labor economists such as David Autor have explained that jobs are a bundle of tasks, a continuum of tasks, and only some tasks are prone to be replaced by technology. The OECD, which is not far away from here, has explained us that, for instance, only 9% of the available jobs are prone to be replaced, but at the same time, 40% of the current jobs may be somehow impacted, may be displaced. They have to be reorganized. So first of all, let's get rid of this quantitative discussion and let's look at the factors that prevent the full automation from happening. And what we are witnessing, as you may realize, is the proliferation of poorly paid, poorly organized, of bad jobs. So instead of automating them away, we constantly witness the emergence of poorly paid or crappy jobs. And this is the human limit to automation, which is a combination of 2 main factors. First of all, the technical feasibility. Many jobs cannot be automated because they involve a degree of complexity, of tacit knowledge, of dexterity, if we are discussing about manual jobs, that cannot be easily taught to a line of code, that cannot easily programmed. And this is the technological, the technical limit, stumbling block. But at the same time, we have another more worrisome limit, which is, of course, the convenience of cheap labor. And this is representing a cap of innovation. The large availability of low-cost occupations is making innovation and automation, if you want to adopt this definition, less urgent, less economically convenient. And a clear example of this is the pandemic, right? Back in February 2020, people, even commentators, were claiming that the rules on distancing, the need to be isolated, could have resulted in a large adoption of robots and technology. Many people were claiming that technology do not get sick. Perhaps they were also hoping that they don't go on strike, as it happens here in Paris, of course. But even during this moment, we haven't been able to record a spike in automation. And this is a further demonstration of the fact that not even the rules on distancing have resulted in a massive process of automation. Now, just to have a very quick overview of the terminology that I'm gonna adopt in this talk, I would like to focus on algorithms that can be seen as a set of complex or rigid modular instructions that are meant to pursue a given goal on the basis of computational power, on the basis of data, and so on and so forth. Another important element that I will be focusing on is AI, artificial intelligence, understood as a set of software that can be, in a way, standalone or embedded in other physical technology. And then they are, in a sense, able to reproduce, to mimic capabilities that humans associate with their own intelligence. From a legal perspective, there is another set of definitions that is quite important because it is already present in several legislation that we can count on at the European and currently also at the national level. And this is the role of automated decision making. This is the neutral definition that we can find in documents such as the General Data Protection Regulation, but also in the newly proposed directive on platform work. Right today, half an hour ago, the European Parliament, for instance, approved the text that will form part of the negotiation between the three institutions of the European Union. So automated decision-making is quite important because it is not simply descriptive. It is not a way to measure, to describe the workplace. For the purposes of labor law, the importance of automated decision-making is connected to the fact that automated decision-making is also prescriptive. These tools are capable of limiting what we could call the horizons of opportunities. And as I'm going to detail in a moment, autonomy, agency, and self-determination is crucial at the workplace level. But in order to support these set of practices, we must look at the underlying infrastructure. And here, the underlying infrastructure are data, personal data, big or small data, without which all these technologies could not be operating in such an efficient way. And this is quite important because at the workplace level, which is a sensitive environment, data have always been considered as something worth protecting, as I'm gonna detail in a moment. Now, to debunk another mythology, I would like to stress the fact that first of all, these data-driven practices cause a slow, undetected, invisible restructuring of the relationship. And there is another problem in terms of the acquiescence that we have towards this technology. There is a double standard, right? Many technologies that are driven by AI are somehow presented as a silver bullet to address and solve all problems that are plaguing ordinary workplaces, from administrative bottlenecks to systemic disparity or other problems that could be related to compliance with occupational health and safety. To a certain extent, this is true, but we should try to avoid the trope according to which these benefits can justify all the other legal issues that we've been dealing with. And I would try to avoid the rhetoric of the so-called black box. Very often we've been told that it's almost impossible to describe the inner working of algorithms, right? They are too complex. The code mutates after a decision has been taken. So there's no way to look at it. It cannot be documented. It is not legible. We could trust it, but it's not our job to look into it. And in a sense, I could also buy this rhetoric as long as we put in place some kind of safeguards and guidelines that are proper to the legal environment, and in particular to labor law, which is my background, my discipline. Labor law, in a sense, is used to deal with uncertainty, and there are some procedural and substantive rules that are precisely meant to leverage lack of information. We have several rules, legal rules, that have been implemented to avoid uncertainty or just to deal with uncertainty. Presumptions, the shifting of the burden of proof, meaning that the person, the entity who has access to information is bound to share it with judiciaries, for instance, and other tools that can be used to hold algorithm accountable, but also to reshape company practices. In my opinion, we don't simply need transparency. Transparency has been weaponized to basically offer plenty of data and information that cannot be legible to layperson. The idea is to make company practices documentable, accessible, in order to make these practices not only convenient, efficient, but also sustainable, fit for purpose, and not useless. Looking at the technology, I would like to look at the exploration that I've been conducting in the last years. It's a pilot, but as a lawyer, I wanted to look at the concrete reality under the assumption that first, we know a lot about the gig economy. In a sense, I've been contributing to the deluge of research papers, materials, case notes. So this phenomenon has been properly illustrated in the literature. We also know a lot about big companies such as Amazon. Every day there is a new report on the collision between robots and pickers or stalkers. But on the contrary, when it comes to ordinary, conventional workplaces, very little is known. So I try to build a questionnaire to share with workers in consultancy, in the transport sector, in the finance sector, in the trade sector, in an attempt to learn more about the concrete adoption of AI-driven technology in these ordinary sectors. I clustered the results in four main pillars. First of all, the role of surveillance and monitoring. Second, the organization of work. Third, the procedure put in place to recruit and to hire workers. And then the company restructurings induced by the pandemic. The clear example here is the adoption of remote work arrangements. I'm not gonna discuss the methods and the detail. I'm a very beginner, but the wealth of knowledge that emerged from this conversation with workers was quite impressive. And to summarize the key results, I would say that what we're witnessing in a selection of companies, of course, in two countries, the study focused on Italy and Spain. Actually, what we're witnessing is a big chunk of micromanagement practices based on the constant duty for workers to report every single activity. Many workers were complaining that a big part of their working time was devoted to describing, to reporting the activities to employers rather than focusing on meaningful tasks. Then there was another issue of constant assessment, both in those tasks and teams that are working in a collaborative way. In this case, of course, the step taken by a coworker is also needed to complete the task for the following coworker, but also customers, final clients, in a sense, were exercising a form of control and monitoring. And on the technology side, there was another interesting finding. I mean, going through the transcripts of the interviews with workers, we learned that technology was not even an issue. I mean, some managers were using WhatsApp to share instructions, orders, or Teams was turned into a dystopian tool because workers were asked at the morning to say, "Good morning, I'm here, I'm taking a break," when they needed to go to the restroom. There was this kind of proliferation of surveillance to the last smallest action. And this is coupled with the adoption of dysfunctional technologies that had been repurposed, reconverted to pursue a goal that wasn't meant to be pursued at the very conception of the technology. In this obsession for data, managers were collecting as much data as possible to the point of not being able to use it. And what we also learned that in terms of critical decisions, such as promotion, the pay raise, the selection of new people in the team, managers had very long and boring meetings to address the issue in a very discrete and physical manner, rather than relying on the technology and on the data. And this was a way to hide human decision behind the technology. Final takeaway, the agency of workers was severely constrained. The pressure exercised on the method, the pace, and also the tempo of the task was rather significant. And this, of course, is also coupled with a very critical reduction in the self-determination. Workers were not able to making decisions at the workplace level. The final important piece of information that I'm happy to share with you is that we started looking at technology and we realized that very often there are no technological solutions to organizational problems. So the underlying organizational structure have a relatively more important weight in explaining the relationship between employers, managers, and workers. Please.
Can you go back 2 slides of the first one, the earlier one? The one about the method. So you said you start to interview, it's quantitative evidence. So like, did you collect also quantitative evidence on the topic?
No.
So that's quantitative?
Yes.
All right.
Sorry, yes.
I was being confused by that.
Yeah, sorry, no, thank you for flagging that.
And also for the 4 different categories of use of decision-making systems. Did you find consistent findings across the 4 topics, or do you find any boundary conditions?
Yeah. That is another interesting piece of information. In particular, when it comes to hiring and recruiting, the level of technology was very limited, or at least confined to the very preliminary phases in all sectors. In particular, in the sectors where manual activities are involved. People wanted to test the workers by means of interviews or even proper tests in the transport sector. While on the in the other two first examples, the surveillance, monitoring, and the organization, the level of penetration of technology was quite intense across all the sectors that we considered. There were many customer management software in the retail trade sector. In the more consultancy and corporate world, there were more collaborative tools that were supposed to measure the time spent on each and every task, also for billing purposes. So I would say that it was quite uniform. And of course, the restructuring spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic was also very homogeneous in terms of adoption of remote work, even if many workers were complaining that at the very first occasion, many managers wanted them to go back to the office. But I would say that the big exception, at least stemming from this qualitative analysis, is the cluster of hiring and the selection of workers. That was the area that we called hiring 1.0, because the penetration of technology was quite limited. So to conclude on this, the other interesting point is that, of course, the managers were in the examples that we consider were using technology and data-driven practices to expand and routinize their authority. And these resulted in the increase in the number of center of powers, which is something that is interesting for the purposes of labor regulation. And the interesting part is precisely the role of what we call algorithmic bosses. In the book, we focused on three cases that could be used to understand the relationship between technology and workers. First, we look at factories, warehouses, where workers and robots are starting to collaborate, meaning that they are sharing the same environment. And many legal scholars have started to propose new solutions, such as the legal personhood for robots. We are totally against it, and also the EU institutions have dropped this proposal, but it's quite interesting to look at the increased psychological, psychosocial, and physical risks at the workplace level that, in a sense, are also caused by the adoption of technology. Then we also consider the case of the pandemic, learning a lot from the experience that we have labeled the pandemic panopticon. The adoption of technology for both essential frontline workers, those workers that had no choice but to show up at work despite the challenging circumstances, and online workers, those workers that were allowed to work from home. In both cases, we have witnessed the adoption of technology. In one case, there were technology to verify the distance, like lasers that were beeping where two workers were within virus catching distance. In the case of remote work, the anxious manager wanted to look digitally over the shoulders of the worker under the erroneous assumption that workers don't stay motivated on their own, something that has been also demystified by the data that are starting to appear on the productivity during the pandemic. You may object that, of course, it was almost impossible to go outside, so workers had no choice but to work, but the lack of physical close contact didn't mean a complex problem in terms of productivity. This means that there is room for unsupervised autonomy. There's the opportunity of designing methods that are based on trust, responsibility, management by objectives, without measuring tasks and deliverables in a very discrete and antiquated manner. And then we also looked at the literature coming from the USA in the field of matchmaking, of hiring. And this is quite complex. In particular, profiling in the European Union context is regulated in the General Data Protection Regulation. There is, as I'm going to argue in a moment, a general ban on automated decision-making, including profiling, which is defined under Article 4. The problem is also that the adoption of these tools in the selection of the workplace is resulting in a quite homogeneous company culture based on the hidden flaws and also very well-known problems connected with this technology. The theory, the conceptualization of this trend is what we call a genetic variation of power at the workplace level. Every time we discuss about technology, we have to broaden the picture and look at the contractual and power dynamics throughout the entire life cycle of company decisions and relationships, from hiring to firing, passing through promotion, allocation of tasks, or even surveillance and monitoring. Human bosses are currently being assisted or even replaced by technology. And this is the problem that we're facing. Technology is not coming from our jobs, it is coming from managers' tasks. This is also confirmed by recent data related to the mass redundancies in the tech sector. Middle managers, there was a statement released yesterday by Zuckerberg, for instance, claiming that in order to flatten the organization, many middle managers were about to be fired and to be replaced by this technology. What is problematic here is that, again, I'm not in favor of human bosses. Human bosses are far from perfect. We are always, we are somehow used to the idea of biased human bosses. The quite interesting part of the story is that the current legal framework has designed a set of countervailing factors to address biases, problems in human bosses. All these counterweights are not able to address some of the most insidious parts of the exercise of power by these algorithmic bosses. And the other problem is that when it comes to the limits to this excess of power, the current limits are based on working time limitation, workplace limitation, and also contractual limitation, meaning that the vast bulk of counterweights only applies to employees, those that are hired under an employment relationship. These practices are basically spilling beyond control to the point of being applicable also to self-employed workers that fall outside of the scope of the protection of employment law. And this is another problem. There is a kind of universalization of the power of bosses also towards self-employed workers that are supposed to be more autonomous by definition. This is a map of the regulation that could be applicable to the practices that I've been mentioning so far. As you can see, the model, not the model, but the framework is quite intricate. There are many overlaps, some glitches, and also some inconsistencies. Actually, the very golden rule is the General Data Protection Regulation, and in particular, Article 22, with the general prohibition on automated decision-making practices. But these must be also read in conjunction with the newly proposed AI Act, not so new. It was presented in April 2021, and it is still under discussion. And then new regulations that are emerging, for instance, the proposed directive on improving working conditions in platform work. So personal data are covered by the General Data Protection Regulation, but AI technology are regulated in the AI Act. And this creates a clash because the GDPR is quite technology neutral, as I'm gonna explain in a moment, while on the contrary, the AI Act is rather narrowly focused on this specific technology And then there is also a contradiction according to the legal classification, the employment classification of workers. Self-employed workers are protected in a certain way, also thanks to the platform to business regulation that mandates for transparency and accountability rules, while employed workers are not protected by the GDPR because of a big exception, the so-called contractual necessity exception, but at the same time, they can have some kind of safeguards. I don't want to be that boring, but to basically summarize the legal argument, going back to the promise of this conversation, we need to shift our perspective in a sense. We should avoid the ex post damage control approach and be able to adopt a preemptive, collective, and multidimensional approach. The idea is to look at several areas of the law, data protection, non-discrimination, collective rights, to mobilize them in conjunction, not to fix problems, but to avoid risks before they materialize in practices that cannot be corrected at the workplace level. So the idea is to look at instruments such as the data protection impact assessment under Article 35 of the General Data Protection Regulation. This is a participatory tool. All stakeholders must be involved in the identification of the risk on fundamental rights and principles and freedoms at the workplace level. The idea is to develop a document which is not a box ticking exercise, is quite an adventure, a collective adventure in isolating the risk, informing people about the risk, and putting in place mitigation strategy to address those risks. This is also coupled with Article 13, 14, and 15, which lay down some important rights as regards information and access to data. And then the other interesting part here is the role of anti-discrimination law. Anti-discrimination law is quite important in the field of mitigating risks stemming from AI-driven practices. First of all, because non-discrimination and equality law is not concerned, is not interested in the inner workings, not even in the psychological element. We don't look at the intent of the presumed violator. We simply look at the effects. And this is quite interesting when it comes to algorithms. We don't need to open the black box, these quite intricate and complex set of instructions and line of codes. On the contrary, we can simply rely on evidentiary streamlining practices that partially shiften the burden on the provider of the technology that must be able to demonstrate that first, the technology is not discriminatory, and that there are no alternative and less pervasive ways of completing the same task. The case law in the field of discrimination is rapidly evolving, and you may argue that discrimination is very subtle at the workplace level. Even when it is conducted by means of technology, you can discriminate someone based on the laptop that she's using, or you can infer the location by looking at the IP address, but the laptop, the location are not protected grounds for the purposes of anti-discrimination law. Gender, age, disability, the catalog of protected grounds is quite limited, even if the Court of Justice is starting to interpret it in a broadened sense. Now, there are some interesting conceptualization and theory, such as discrimination by proxy and discrimination by association, that could be used to tackle algorithmic technology. Again, I'm not saying that the legal framework is meant to stifle innovation, to hinder the adoption of this technology. On the contrary, the idea is to restructure company practices, to make them legible, and to allow for human oversight. And this should be important also for offering an argument to reduce the vulnerability, the legal risk that many companies are facing precisely because they are adopting technology that are designed and produced by third parties. And this is something that emerged also from the exploration, from the qualitative exploration. Many managers are not fully aware of the operation of the technology because basically they are renting the technology from an external provider. Since I'm afraid I'm running out of time, I will skip the part on the gig economy, but here the point was that we should not fall and we should not commit the same mistake. We spent many years to understand the logic behind the company practices put in place by many platform operators. So we were somehow confused even by the terminology. We start discussing about the so-called sharing economy using this sense of overhyped enthusiasm. Then we realized that it was nothing more than a way of organizing the workforce by limiting the cost, relying on very robust managerial prerogatives and liquid responsibilities. But the EU institutions are at the forefront of a big campaign of regulating technology. Now, you may argue that Europe is always the old lady trying to fix the problems when in other places people are working on the technology, on inventing technology rather than regulating it. To a certain extent, we would say that for the first time, the EU was right. And first, the approach taken in the field of platform work has proved to be quite effective, precisely because the EU institutions have proposed, in particular the Commission, a directive which is based on the rulings coming from member states. So the factors, the elements that are included in the new directive are shared with Supreme Courts, such as the French Cour de Cassation, the Spanish Tribunal Supremo, the Italian Corte di Cassazione. This is a way of embedding findings coming from bottom up in the top-down legislation. This is the wording of the new directive. There is a set of rules that are aimed at triggering a presumption of employment, but I don't want to engage in the very perennial fight against employment versus self-employment when it comes to classifying workers in the platform economy. What is interesting for me to highlight is that we should be able to admit that employment and flexibility can go hand in hand. There is no lack of efficiency when solid workplace and contractual arrangements are adopted, precisely because the employment contract is a legal framework based on authority. The boss, the manager, is legitimized by the legal framework to exercise power. This authority, this upstream authority, is exceptional in the legal framework. Only managers, employers, and bosses have the authority to organize, to monitor, and to discipline workers. This is not an abuse. This is acknowledged by the legal framework. This is authorized by the legal framework precisely for the purposes of running the business in a quite efficient way. So the inherent flexibility of standard contracts can offer a powerful vehicle for integration and company success. To conclude on the regulation, I would like to stress the new and the recent novelties, in particular contained in the proposed for a directive improving conditions of platform workers. There are two important articles regulating automated monitoring and automated decision-making. workers in the platform economy, only in this dimension, must be informed about the adoption of automated monitoring and automated decision-making, about the actions that are going to be monitored, and about the decisions that are made by technology. This is reinforced under Article 8 by the right of obtaining an explanation, which was included in a recital in the preamble of the General Data Protection Regulation, but it is now reality. Obtaining an explanation is crucial. Again, an explanation that can be understandable by workers, not a set of lines of codes. And then there is a collective dimension in the proposed Platform Work Directive, because this information and consultation rights can be exercised by platform worker representatives. This is a model, the model of prescriptive legislation enshrined in the proposal for a directive on platform work. There is another model that I would like to explore very briefly with you, which is the model of the AI Act. It is based on a significantly different approach, which is the so-called risk-based approach. Many players in the industry are trying to understand the way in which the AI Act is going to be affecting their companies. First of all, there are 4 levels of risk, as you can see from the slides: unacceptable and prohibited risk, such as those risks that may result in deception. Then we have high risk and minimal and limited risk. Even if we find this categorization in the AI Act, the center, the core of the Act is devoted to high risk. The system put in place is based on anticipatory models, meaning that providers, before putting a technology, an AI-driven technology in the market, must be able to demonstrate compliance with mandatory requirements in terms of data accuracy. And this assessment must be carried out by providers. It is a self-assessment, a peremptory self-assessment. And the high-risk AI technology, this definition includes those technologies that are adopted in the field of employment, management, and access to self-employment. There are 2 examples: recruiting and making decision again. So the AI Act is designing a framework which is not prescriptive, and this is something that is starting to emerge at all latitudes. The same is happening in the USA and also in Canada. In the USA, you have a new agency, the NIST, which is deploying the so-called AI risk management framework together with the Algorithmic Accountability Act. At the federal level, at the state level, you have new bills adopted or proposed to limit, for instance, interviews when it comes to hiring. And the same is happening in Canada. What is the model, please?
About how AI has a high risk in the employment or the hiring, but in which steps? Because you show us several steps. Are you sure maybe in the CV filtering of people should AI has a risk, or it's more as a help? No? For example, just in the first view of all the CVs,
the first screening. No, correct. The issue is that this is not my opinion. This is the model proposed by the EU institution, in particular by the Commission. And I agree with you that there is an issue with this classification. It is very rigid. And the functions of AI are designed, are conceived in the AI Act, and they cannot be changed. So recruitment and selection of natural person, advertising vacancies, screening and filtering, and also making decisions are considered by default to be high-risk AI applications. And the model is not that rigid, I would say, because after acknowledging that these technologies are posing high risk, to freedoms, to rights, and to principles. The model is based on a self-assessment. So the provider has to carry out an examination based on the, you could say, a threefold method of risk assessment. So risk identification, risk management, and risk communication. These are the rules, these are the duties for the providers. But when it comes to this classification, it's not my idea, it's the content of the proposed AI Act. Many ideas have been proposed also to redefine the model because it doesn't take into account the fact that AI technologies may be repurposed, meaning that they are both to complete a task and then they are customized by the adopter, by the user, according to the terminology of the AI Act. But to say something more on the model, this is quite interesting because when it comes to new technology, one central component of the challenge is the role of uncertainty. And in the past, we have been discussing about the fact that law is not able to keep pace with technology, right? Again, the model based on risk assessment, on the so-called risk-based approach, in a sense, seems to address these problems. The risk is a way of regulating highly technical sector. It is based on knowledge. It is based not on a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather on a calibration, on a collaborative environment. This is the way forward, I would say. At least this seems to be at the global level, the way in which the regulator, the legislature, is trying to deal with uncertain, highly technical, and even very critical sectors. But the final point that I would like to share with you is a stark discrepancy between fundamental rights at the workplace level, fundamental rights such as autonomy, self-determination, equality, non-discrimination, as I said before, and the adoption of a quantitative modular perspective based on the risk. So the contribution here would be along the lines of deploying collaborative company practices. This is often neglected, right? I mean, collective forces, social partners, worker representatives are considered as insidious, right? Representing a threat to the organization of the workplace. But there are important tools, important strategies that are available in the toolkit of labor law. For instance, consultation. According to Article 88 of the General Data Protection Regulation, at the national level, new tools, new methods can be deployed in order to involve workers in the adoption of new technology. And according to the tradition of many countries, Italy, France, Spain, workers, or even better, their representatives, must be involved when the managers are contemplating the adoption of a new technology. In countries such as Italy, worker representatives have also a veto power that can be only solved by administrative authorities of the Ministry of Labor. This is further reinforced under Article 5 of the General Data Protection Regulation, which sets a certain threshold of principles that must be complied with: transparency, accuracy, data minimization, purpose limitation, and so on and so forth. There is another interesting part, which is the multi-stakeholder involvement of workers. Again, under the assumption that those that are going to be affected by a technology must be participating in the design of the technology itself. And again, the data protection impact assessment is a quite interesting tool that could be used to further improve the company practices. And of course, the places for conducting these multi-stakeholder approach are many, not only at the company, but also before data protection authorities, which have proved to be quite responsive, quite proactive. And then the final point, which is coming from organizational studies, from management studies, when there is a correspondence between those who design the metrics, the company practices, also those that are based on technology, and the subject, this technology, then there is increased room for productivity, for wellness. I wouldn't say happiness, but perhaps we are heading towards this goal. So the final important issue is based on the idea of co-designing the new technology and training workers when it comes to digital skills and literacy in an attempt to make the adoption of these practices and this technology not necessarily not only convenient, but also effective in terms of reception by the workers. I'm gonna stop here because I'm very interested in having a discussion with you. Thanks again for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Antonio, for this super brilliant presentation, insightful. We are out of the domain of regulation, and regulation is super important in the development of the AI-enabled environment, as you described. I leave the word to the discussant, because in the format we use in this seminar, we have a discussant coming from the company and a top discussant, as in this case. And then we will have an open question with the people in the room and also the people online.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.
So I've taken some comments based on my experience, and thank you for this presentation, because I learned many things regarding, in particular, the regulation. Even if sometimes we say that, you know, the Europeans invent the regulation and the Americans invent the algorithm. And but what is for sure, I guess, is our world is becoming an algo economy. It's an algo business world with data-driven economy. I think that it's very interesting, because in my business, I was in charge of a big communication group, which is Publicis first and then Dentsu, Japanese company. And we know how the companies need to get data to understand their consumer. And there is, I don't know who did this, but you know, the more data you have, the less disrupted you are. And the most disrupted sectors in the economy are the FMCG sectors, because they don't get the data, because they are intermediaries. As each company, because they get the data. The second comment that I'm interested in is that the robocalypse things you mentioned. And I think what is interesting is that the gig jobs are being replaced for sure. We are going to be replaced, but we see so many bankers, so high level jobs that are replaced by algorithm. But what is interesting is that, you know, in South Korea, for instance, which is the country in the world which has the more robots per head, they don't have any unemployment. If you look at the automotive industry in Germany, for instance, between 2010 and 2020, Germany has created 600,000 jobs in the automotive industry. France has lost a lot of jobs in this industry, because Germany has robotized its industry with high-level jobs, and it's exactly what Adidas is doing at the moment, relocating factories in Germany with engineers, because you need engineers, so high-level jobs just to maintain the factory. And it's the first time in the last 30 years that Adidas has a new factory in Germany for these shoes. In the creative industry where I have been working, I think it's interesting, because historically tech has always been important for the art. I see the Seine River here. You know what? The Impressionism, for instance, is coming not only because the guys has an idea, is because they could go to the Seine River by train. That's the reason why Impressionism, you know, the movement has been invented as well, thanks to the technology. In the creative industry, you know, the crypto art, the generative NFT, all these things is based on AI for sure, and it's getting a lot of success. In the advertising, algorithm thanks to data and the targeting things. You know, when you want to go to Turkey and then you have so many information then about Turkey. This is, of course, data-driven economy. And in a couple of years, you're going to have exactly the same on television. In terms of organization, because you spoke a bit on organization, I think what is the data-driven economy allows, you know, according to me, the organization to be less vertical and probably more horizontal, because it's a more rational way to decide. And today, when you are a boss or when a chief, it's Jacques Chirac who said once, un chef doit chefer, which means that the chef is the only guy who takes the decision, and you have at the low level people who are just executing. I think thanks to the data-driven economy, you know, managers will decide more rationally and not only based on intuition. Thanks to, of course, learning machine. Thanks to as well deep learning, even if the GDPR regulation protects all the employees against all of this. I just and then we can have a chat. And I enjoy what you said about anticipation. And especially about algorithm. I've been working on cyber harassment for Institut Montaigne, and I wrote a document about that, and we defended and we promoted our ideas in the Assemblée Nationale, in the Parliament. And we had a lot of discussion about how we control the algorithm. In a country just like France, we pretend to be an engineer country. We love to understand the algorithm, and we love to go to Mountain View and say to Google, I want to understand your algorithm. I don't believe in that. I believe that exactly what we propose to the Parliament, and they have taken into consideration this is that controlling algorithm is just impossible. You go to Mountain View, you have 5 people, even 50 people who explain you something. You go back to Europe and say, yes, I understood everything. And then Google, in the meantime, has changed almost everything permanently. What we can do regarding algorithm is exactly what we do in finance, in this banking system, with stress test. Is exactly what we propose to the Senate and the National Assembly here. So just test the outcome of the algorithm. And we say in the cyber harassment thing where decision has to be taken within 10 days, otherwise it's a disaster for the young lady or for the boy. So we test it, we say, this is what's happening, cyber harassment, what is the outcome? What do you decide in terms of the message on your social networks? And then I think new jobs are going to be invented in the audit of algorithm. And companies who create their own algorithm probably will ask to be audited with external experts. Exactly what happens in finance, because a century ago, I think audit in finance didn't exist. But I guess
in the pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see more and more these type of jobs, auditors of algorithm, not to understand the algorithm, but at least to evaluate the outcome of the algorithm. I think what you mentioned is, as a manager, of course, we have put all the tools regarding sales prediction with Salesforce. So there are so many companies that are doing that. Of course, we have implemented everything just to manage, the agenda, which is, I would say, is the basics, just to sort or to classify the curriculum, of course, candidates. But sometimes we have a very negative view about the way algorithm could, because it manipulates or because they are biased. But we can say as well that we can create positive bias. We lack women. We don't have many engineers, women. So we can see, and it's exactly what SKEMA, which is a big French company, is doing. They are producing, aircraft engines, and they try not to recruit or to give a big responsibility to women engineers. They try to find which woman could be at the head of a factory. not being an engineer, and they find women coming from finance who have been, chosen as CEO of factories. And I think in this aspect, for big companies, having tools that can identify the profile of, has a positive, as a, I would say, a positive approach just to promote the diversity. And I think the tools might be something interesting. So in terms of organization, I think it's less vertical. I think it can help replace many things, of course, just to dedicate time to more value tasks in particular. But I think it could have also a positive impact in terms of who we choose, who we retain, in order to give more chance to people who would not exactly look like the way we are, because the bias when you are a manager is just to try to recruit someone who looks like you, coming from the same business schools, for instance. And I think in this matter, if the algorithm is transparent, and this is exactly what you said, how can we make the algorithm transparent for everyone, including when you consider that one of the criteria could be something just to promote women in particular, or people coming from, from the poor suburbs in the big cities. And in this aspect, if it's transparent, I think it can work. So that's the comments I wanted to make from my experience.
Yeah. Can you say 2 words about your
so
activity?
just I was just in charge of a company there, Dentsu. I don't know if you know, Dentsu has media agencies, advertising agencies, sport business, etc., etc. It's a big company. And now I have created a startup in the Web3 blockchain that has been financed by Fnac Darty, which is a big group in the cultural industry. And I'm helping creating the tech platform to help creators, artists, cultural institutions and brands to explore all the potentiality of the Web3. And in this matter, artificial intelligence to screen the markets, etc., is well spread. And I'm not talking about what we meant when we talk at the beginning of this conversation about the creators themselves that are using the artificial intelligence to create their artwork. And I think it's going to be something interesting in the art business.
Yeah. Now we open the discussion. Be free to share the question.
Yeah, I just want to make a point on the things that you were talking about. You were talking about how the algorithms are biased and how important is the transparency of the algorithm. I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't fully agree with that because, I mean, the algorithm... The algorithm has a task. The bias comes from the data, not from the algorithm. I mean, in my... for example, now I'm working and I'm applying a transformer algorithm to online data, online reviews. And I've seen how sexist people are in the online reviews regarding, for example, the service of the restaurants. No, the sentiment is very bad when it's a female, it's a waitresses or her, she, blah. But if it's a man, the sentiment is very high. So it comes from the data, not from the algorithm that it's modeling that.
I do not disagree with you. I agree with you. What criteria do you choose in order to make your algorithm work? So it's what data are you collecting? This is a human decision. So the bias, that's the reason why I was talking about the algorithm coming from the platforms, in particular the US platforms, because the problem we have as well is that most of what we are going to do through algorithm, 100% or almost 100% of the algorithm are made in the US. And culturally speaking, this is a challenge because the way this is the world, it's not exactly the way Facebook sees the world or Google sees the world is not exactly the way I want to see the world. But, that's why I was speaking about how can you promote diversity with this type of tools, with the criteria and with the data you want to collect. Because if the data, which is where are you from, is a key criteria, it has to be well identified into the algorithm. So I agree with you.
May I say something, just because the point is very interesting, and you mentioned the field of, the retail service sector. From a labor law perspective, we tend to say that much emotional labor is involved in this sector, because you try to be nice with the final customer, because you know that the review left at the end of the service is going to be impactful on your own career. At the same time, I would like to understand better, what do you mean about the data are the source? Yes, of course, the data are embedding societal disparities, systemic problems, but is there a way to fix the issue? I'm not totally convinced that technology can solve problems that are ingrained in societal values, because otherwise, if we collect all the data on the USA presidents, right, and we ask an algorithm to spill out the next president is going to be an old male politician, right? There's no women, no possibilities for women to be appointed, to be selected, even by technology. So the idea that data can be somehow polished, can be debiased, is not totally compelling to me, because I don't see the technical feasibility of improving society by improving the data. Perhaps it's the other way around.
It's not, as he was mentioning, it's not only the data, of course, as you did, it's also the parameters from which you are that you are using in that algorithm. It's not only data. Of course, if you have only males as president, at the end, what is going to predict? Of course, it's going to predict a male, not a female. So this is how you put a weight to that parameter that will have a different outcome.
That is interesting. And another point that we make in the book is perhaps we should give more value to something that is not quantifiable. This is also the trap that we've been dealing with. Looking at quantifiable items, the numbers of smiles received by a waiter, the number of positive reviews, perhaps those data are not necessarily meaningful for the purposes of promotion, evaluation of the task that you're trying to complete.
Of course. At the end, it's not about only the technology, the algorithm, or the computer scientists. They have to work hand by hand with the field that they are working. If it's health department or wherever, they have to work with people that have the knowledge on that field.
Agree.
Yeah.
Of course.
There's something to do. Who is doing the job to define the criteria, the parameters? Absolutely.
Of course,
it's exactly what that.
The expertise, the people that have the expertise on that field, no?
Yeah.
And
this is a company decision. At the end, in the communication industry, you have 54% of women, but in the advertising agency, you have maybe 5% of creative director. So don't be surprised when you see a commercial on television. 80% of the experts talking about something are male. And have a look on the COVID thing, because you're interested in this matter. 85% of the experts during the COVID crisis were men in Europe. And talking about Ukraine and the geopolitics, I think it's 5% women. It looks like the women are on stage because they are the journalists. It's not exactly the same thing asking the question that being the expert of the topic. And this is the company decision. This is a company decision, human decision. But what I want to say, and I think we share this, if the technology is not responsible for that, but the technology, if you define the right task to the algorithm, can give you really valuable data and help you to change and to contribute to change the world in this matter.
No, and the selection of the metrics is crucial. Yeah. Again, there are many examples of, for instance, focus on very narrow deliverables, right? If you measure the number of emails that have been sent, the number of hours that you spend in front of the screen, all this obsession with very narrow data is undermining the process of evaluation. I mean, I could be sending hundreds of stupid emails with memes. Should I be assessed on the basis of the email in terms of corporate contribution? That would be a very flawed metric. The same when it comes to the hours spent completing a task. This narrow focus excludes the collaboration, the creative component, the meetings, the discussion, even the training for new people that have joined the company. If you only measure the time spent on Teams, on collaborative software, then you are missing many components of the work.
Yeah, I agree. You know, if you measure the engagement of someone by the number of emails he sends per day, this is something ridiculous. But someone took the decision to ask the algorithm to measure that. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Another question?
I just wanted to add something about this. Also training part of the algorithm bias, and as what I've been said before, that the bias comes from the data, but actually as the professor surely know, an Italian tradition of the Tribunale di Bologna, who actually recognizes the bias on the algorithm itself. So the main problem would be to improve the training itself for the society, so they could actually add into the system and modify the information in the algorithm, because the conversation was on delivery and transport society, and the main problem were caused by the fact that the society didn't add some, let's say, absent justification into the system. So this is also a major problem, and also a major problem that comes to with the dialogue with the labor organization. And on this point, maybe in France, it is there is a book that has recently been published from the DGP, and it's actually talks about how to understand the algorithm as for the workers. So the main purpose is actually to try to explain how the algorithm works, so the workers can firstly understand the artificial intelligence, and then try to intervene and operate, actually claim and understand what they could claim.
That's a very interesting story. And again, I commented a bit on the role of anti-discrimination law. And one of the very first applications, one of the first is the one that you mentioned. It's the case of the algorithm used back in 2020 by the delivery platform Deliveroo. The name of the algorithm was Frank, and there is something that could be quite interesting also for people working in management. Actually, the algorithm was programmed, was designed to treat all workers the same, which is precisely the definition, the potential definition of indirect discrimination, meaning that the algorithm was not capable of considering exceptions. And in particular, it was an algorithm based on two important metrics, like the availability of workers and, let's say, the constant presence of workers. The algorithm managed to punish, to de-rank, to sanction those workers that were basically absent because they were attending a strike, or they were taking care of the elderly, or when they were sick. So the lack of flexibility of the algorithm to consider the source, the reason for being absent, was deemed to be a potential indirect discrimination. Treating people all the same without considering the reason for being absent was considered by the Court of Bologna as one of the sources of indirect discrimination. Indirect discrimination is a complex matter. It can be justified, but in particular, as the case teaches us, this is quite important because potential virtual hypothetical workers that think to be at risk of being discriminated. In the Bologna case, there was no single person that was actually discriminated, but only the possibility of being impacted by this blind algorithm, as the court defined it, resulted in what we call a prima facie case of discrimination, and the company was not able to justify the adoption of technology, also because the company didn't want to reveal the inner working of the algorithm using some kind of IP and industrial secrecy justification. Again, this is one of the first pioneering cases in Europe, but this is to say that there is a lot of potential in anti-discrimination law, and companies must be aware of this. Again, the algorithm was in a sense very dumb because it was not designed to consider exception, to diverge from the standard. And this was a problem for a company itself that had to change the algorithm itself. I don't want to bore
No.
the story.
I think you're fully right, but it's not the responsibility of the technology. Someone asked, to measure the people who are on strike and people who are, and people have done this. CEO has done this for even without technology, before the electricity as well. The only thing is that with the algorithm, you have the information in real time, and this is accelerating maybe, the decision the manager is taking. That's the reason why my humble recommendation is to create, independent auditors that make sure that the algorithm used by the company is compliant regarding the regulation, at least our regulation. Because I know that Microsoft, for instance, in the US, which is not linked to the GDPR, has an algorithm that optimize your work time, just to be sure that you dedicate, 10% for new business, X% for your clients, and X% for administrative tasks. You can do this in the US. You cannot do this in Europe. So now, if I say so, is that the algorithm and the way we manage this has the cultural nuances has something to do with that. Regarding the security things, when you are in Asia, security, you are okay to give all your data just to be safe. Same in the US, not exactly the same. Here, we are very keen. And the GDPR thing is the German, French, and Spanish at the origin. And this has something to do with our history. Yeah. And this is very interesting because other countries, they didn't much care about the data protection. And because we have this particular history in the 20th century in France, in Germany, and in Spain, the three countries were promoting the GDPR regulation. Because there is this cultural thing that makes us very distant from giving our data, even if we want to be protected. So it's a challenge because, in the cyber harassment project we mentioned, we had this problem with the platforms as well, because the way, the speeches, on the social platforms, the way you see it, the way you say this has to be erased and this has not to be erased is very different from a market to another. And as far as the decision is taken somewhere else than in France in particular, that's the reason why the Digital Act asked the platform to have a legal representative in every market, just to make them not only responsible, but to make them not only responsible but accountable for their decision. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that the roots of these rights are quite important. And again, this could be very important for all disciplines. The GDPR, which was based on a previous European directive adopted in 1995, stems from a German principle. Actually, in the German constitution, there is no reference to the right to privacy, to the right of data protection, but there is a very crucial, important right, which is considered the right to decency, right? And the interpretation of this right has been very broad as to include something that has been considered informational self-determination. It could be a quite complex definition. Basically, informational self-determination means that people must be free to make decisions based on their preferences without being constrained in their decision making. If I'm only bombarded by job advertising that are decided by an algorithm, I would never apply to something. If the platform is designed in a way to exclude from a drop-down menu a certain age preferences, some people are gonna be excluded. If the algorithm for hiring workers is based on the continuity of employment, it is likely that women are gonna be excluded because women get pregnant and they, of course, cannot work for at least a certain number of months. Again, informational self-determination is a wonderful value. We should be able to export it. And even if there is no territorial scope of the GDPR, something important is happening. I mean, lawyers call it the so-called Brussels effect. But many USA companies are starting to adopt the GDPR, to comply with the GDPR, first for convenience. Instead of having two different models, it's quite more convenient to have a unique model across the globe. And second, because even states such as California are starting to emulate the content of the GDPR. So we could say that in terms of protection of values, of culture and freedoms, the role of informational self-determination should be something that we are proud of.
Yeah. I think, there is you mentioned that in South America, they have adopted the GDPR, the same regulation that we have in Europe. So at least in that matter, we are influencing the world. Okay, to protect it's not that innovation in the technology, but at least to protect the people.
Just to add something about that you're talking about GDPR, there are some companies that, for example, Apple, people think that they pay for the product, but they also pay for privacy because they don't sell data. They don't use the data to improve their algorithm since I think like 5 years ago, they decided we are not going to do that. That's why their maps are not working very well as Google Maps works, or the Siri, for example, which was kind of Alexa, is working very bad because they don't have data to feed it. They are not listening to your calls, they are not taking into account the chat. So people not only pay for the product quality, but for data privacy. And not many people know that. For example, the courts in US try to take data from bad people, and they told no, because this is forbidden. We have our own law and we sell this privacy to the people that are buying our products.
No.
It was also great marketing. That was also great marketing stuff.
It was a value proposition in a sense, but it's also important. And yes,
it has here. It has the disadvantages. For example, the tools that they use. For example, that Maps, they don't work as well as Google Maps, for example, or Siri. It's not working as because they don't have enough data to.
But this is a constraint, right? I mean, we're not in the Wild West, so innovation must be compliant with the rules. The time of claiming that we are disruptors is far away, I would say. Like, this rhetoric has been profoundly debunked. And the same example can be done with the generative AI, right? 2 months ago, Facebook presented its own Galactic, I remember perhaps was the name, which was the equivalent of ChatGPT, but they realized that it was promoting hate speech, it was biased, it was harassing promising client. So basically they turned off after 2 days. It was a huge fiasco for the company, but they wanted to be compliant. On the contrary, if you deploy something that is unconstrained, unfettered when it comes to respect for the rule, then you're gonna impact very seriously, again, values, principles, and that is the actual concern. This is a challenge not only for lawyers, not only for legal engineers, but also for those that are advising or that are running these kind of businesses.
And I was thinking about what you've just mentioned, the chat GPT. And as far as the efficiency of an algorithm is depending on the quality and the quantity of data, for sure, the chat GPT will give a huge advantage to English-speaking people and creators compared to, Germans, Dutch people, because the data they are collecting in English is so huge that it's going to give an advantage, and then it's going to create gaps between different cultures. And this is a challenge.